The massive chamber of the Galactic Council was filled with murmurs as Captain Eric Voss stood before the alien leaders. The hum of advanced technology surrounded them, glowing panels lining the walls, and enormous screens displaying data from across the galaxy. Today was not just any day. It was the day that would determine the future of a young human soldier. Eric's heart pounded in his chest. He had never imagined himself in a situation like this. He had fought battles, led troops, and faced death many times, but standing before the Galactic Council, a group of some of the most powerful and advanced alien beings in the galaxy, was a whole different kind of challenge. The Council was known for its arrogance, its members representing various species who looked down on humanity as primitive, unworthy of their attention. But today, that was about to change. The head of the Council, an ancient being with glowing purple skin and 6 eyes, raised a clawed hand to silence the room. "We are gathered here today to discuss the final will of the late King Zorak," the leader said, his voice booming through the chamber. He left an unexpected inheritance to the one known as Captain Eric Voss, a human. The room erupted in laughter. It wasn't the inheritance of a fortune or powerful technology, but something far stranger, a daughter. The king's daughter, Princess Lyra, was what Eric had inherited. The council members roared with laughter, a human inheriting an alien princess. One of them sneered, shaking his head. And not just any princess, his ugly daughter, no less. Another alien, with tentacles for arms, added, "The king must have been desperate." Eric could feel their eyes on him, their mocking glances digging into him like daggers. He had no idea why King Zorak had left him this legacy. He barely knew the king, just a few brief encounters during a time of war. And yet, somehow, the king had chosen him to care for his daughter. Despite the ridicule, Eric's expression remained calm, composed. The mockery from the council didn't bother him. What mattered now was what he would do next. The council thought this was a joke, but for Eric, it wasn't. Honor was everything to him, and if this inheritance meant taking responsibility for someone, then that was what he would do. Eric stepped forward, silencing the laughter with a single, steady word. "I accept." The council fell silent. Their amusement shifted into confusion, and then suspicion. The Clixian alien, with its smooth blue skin, scoffed. "You accept a burden. Why would you accept a princess who is known for being hideous? Surely you understand the consequences." Eric didn't flinch. "A promise is a promise. If the king trusted me with this responsibility, I will honor it, no matter what." The leader of the council narrowed his eyes. "You humans, and your sense of honor," he muttered. "Very well, but know this. You will regret it. This daughter is no treasure. She is a stain on her royal bloodline." The others nodded in agreement, their cold eyes studying Eric as though he were a fool. As they spoke, Eric's thoughts raced. He didn't care about what the council said. He wasn't doing this for their approval. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do. But there was something more. Why had King Zorak chosen him? What was it about Lyra that had led the king to leave her in his care? Eric didn't have the answers yet, but he knew one thing. He had to find them. Without another word, Eric turned and made his way out of the chamber. His mission now was clear. He had to travel to the distant planet where Princess Lyra resided. And from what the council had said, she was no ordinary princess. The whispers about her appearance were harsh, calling her ugly, unfit, and even a curse to the royal family. But Eric wasn't so easily swayed by appearances or rumors. If King Zorak had trusted him, then there must be something more to her than met the eye. The ship ride was long, and as Eric sat alone in his cockpit, the weight of what was to come settled on his shoulders. He'd spent his life battling the odds, fighting enemies far stronger than him. But this was a different challenge. The unknown loomed ahead. As his ship entered the atmosphere of Vexuria, the homeworld of the Clixian royal family, Eric felt a strange sense of anticipation. The world outside was full of harsh desert landscapes, towering alien structures, and bright, glowing skies. An alien world far removed from the comforts of Earth. When the ship landed on the outskirts of the royal palace, Eric's eyes scanned the desolate landscape. This place felt abandoned, yet filled with secrets. His boots crunched against the dusty ground as he stepped out of the ship. In the distance, the palace loomed, ancient and regal, but the whispers of the Galactic Council echoed in his ears. "Good luck with that ugly daughter," they had mocked. The Xanter girl didn't respond right away. She tried to lift herself up, wincing as pain shot through her body. Adrian quickly reached out, stopping her. "Easy," he said softly. "You're still hurt." She glared at him, her sharp features hardening with a mixture of defiance and fear. Despite her injuries, she seemed ready to fight. Adrian could see it in her eyes, the warrior spirit that had made her so dangerous in the first place. But something was different now. She wasn't just a mindless soldier under the control of the Xanter regime. She was someone who had been abandoned, left to die alone in the wreckage of her people's war. Adrian carefully examined the wounds on her side, taking note of how deep they were. Her blood had started to clot, but there was still a chance of infection. He needed to clean the wounds and dress them properly, but he wasn't sure how much time they had. The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the city, reminding him that the battle was still raging, and the Xanter weren't the only threat. Without warning, the door to the room suddenly slammed open. Adrian's heart skipped a beat, and he instantly reached for his weapon. But the figure in the doorway wasn't a Xanter drone. It was a human soldier, one of Adrian's squad mates, Sergeant Bonner. "Adrian," Bonner hissed, his eyes wide with disbelief as he looked at the Xanter girl lying on the floor. "What the hell are you doing? She's one of them. You can't trust her." Adrian's mind raced. He couldn't explain why he had helped her, why he had saved her life. It didn't make sense to anyone, but there was something inside him, something that told him that saving her was the right thing to do. The truth was, Adrian didn't trust her completely either, but he had no choice now. She was part of his responsibility. "I couldn't just leave her," Adrian said quietly, meeting Bonner's gaze. "She's human now. She's not the enemy." Bonner shook his head in disbelief, but didn't argue further. He could see the determination in Adrian's eyes. "All right, we need to move. Xanter drones are everywhere, and they won't stop until they find her. We need to get out of here." Adrian nodded, grateful for Bonner's help. As the two men quickly made plans to get the Xanter girl to safety, Adrian glanced at her one more time. She was still watching him, her eyes full of mistrust. But as she looked at him, Adrian saw something else, something that hinted at a bond, however fragile, that had formed between them. The fight for survival was far from Adrian moved swiftly through the shattered streets, the weight of the Xanter warrior in his arms, making each step feel heavier. Her body was limp, but her breathing had slowed into a steady rhythm, a sign that the painkiller was doing its job. Still, he couldn't relax. The city was crawling with Xanter patrols, and the drones, heavily armed and capable of cloaking themselves in the blink of an eye, could be anywhere. He had to find shelter fast, somewhere to keep her safe and tend to her injuries properly. His mind raced with thoughts of how this situation had turned into a nightmare, a human soldier rescuing an enemy combatant. If anyone from his squad found out, they'd never understand. The Xanter were ruthless. They had devastated entire colonies, wiping out civilians without a second thought. Yet here he was, saving one of them. The ground shook slightly as another distant explosion rattled the air. He gritted his teeth, pushing forward. The adrenaline from the battlefield was still coursing through his veins, sharpening his senses and fueling his resolve. But despite the urgency, Adrian couldn't shake the feeling of unease gnawing at him. What if he had made a mistake? What if the Xanter girl wasn't as helpless as she appeared? What if she was just playing dead, waiting for the right moment to strike? Adrian's thoughts were interrupted by a soft groan from the girl in his arms. Her emerald-colored skin had a strange glow to it, even in the dim light, and her black hair was matted with dirt and blood. As he adjusted his grip, she stirred slightly, and for a moment, Adrian thought she might wake up. But she stayed still, her breathing shallow but steady. He needed to find cover, and fast. Turning a corner, Adrian spotted a ruined building ahead, a tall structure that had once been a hospital. It seemed like the perfect place to hide, at least for a little while. He quickened his pace, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of movement. The coast was clear for now, but he knew that could change in an instant. Jason looked at the map, his mind still racing. He had made it this far, but could he go further? Could he really make the decision that would determine the future of humanity? He didn't have much time to think. The machines were coming, and there was no going back. "I'm ready," Jason said, his voice firm. Lyra turned to him, a small but knowing smile crossing her face. "I knew you would be." The silence in the control room was deafening. Jason stood in front of the holographic map, his eyes fixed on the galaxy spread before him. The weight of his decision, made only moments ago, still hung heavily in the air. The machines were closing in, but Jason knew he had made the right choice. This was no longer about survival. It was about taking control of his destiny, about leading the charge against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Lyra's hand rested on his shoulder, a gesture of reassurance, but Jason could sense the tension beneath it. She was as committed to this fight as he was, but there was something unspoken between them. They both knew that the future they were fighting for wouldn't be easy. There would be battles, losses, sacrifices, and not all of them would survive. Jason took a deep breath, his mind settling as he looked around the control room. The Alliance had been preparing for this moment for years, and now that it was finally here, everything felt surreal. He had been thrust into the center of it all, from a soldier fighting on the front lines to a leader with the power to shape the future. The responsibility was immense, and the stakes had never been higher. "We don't have much time," Lyra said, her voice steady but urgent. She turned back to the map, her fingers dancing over the controls. "The machines are almost here. We need to strike before they can organize." Jason nodded. "What's our plan?" Lyra paused for a moment, then turned to him with a serious expression. "We strike the Central Command. If we can destroy their main control center, it will disrupt their communication and coordination. It's a risky move, but it's the only way to slow them down." Jason felt a surge of determination. This was the beginning of their rebellion. This was where they could turn the tide in their favor. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they were just one step away from disaster. The machines had always been a step ahead. They had the advantage of technology, of strategy, of sheer numbers. But they didn't have what Jason had: the will to fight, the will to win. "Let's do it," Jason said, his voice unwavering. He turned to the team. Ben, Rachel, and the others were already suited up, their weapons ready. The team that had fought beside him for so long was now standing together for something greater, something that would change the course of history. They made their way out of the control room and into the heart of the base, where the shuttle was waiting. The engines hummed with quiet power, ready to take them into the heart of enemy territory. Jason's heart raced, but it wasn't fear that drove him. It was purpose. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for the future, for a world where the machines would no longer dictate their lives. As they climbed into the shuttle, Jason took one last look at the base they were leaving behind. It was a symbol of everything they had built, but it was also a symbol of the war they were still fighting. The machines would stop at nothing to crush the resistance, but Jason refused to let that happen. They were stronger than they realized. They had something that the machines couldn't understand: hope, to defend her planet from invaders. But now, here she was, depending on the enemy to keep her alive. She couldn't ignore the irony, nor could she ignore the way her emotions were starting to shift. It was a strange feeling, almost like a slow, creeping betrayal of everything she had ever believed. On the third day, Vera was sitting by the small window in the shelter when she heard something that made her heart skip a beat. The distant hum of a spacecraft. She didn't have to be told to recognize it. Her sharp alien senses detected it immediately. The unmistakable sound of a human fighter ship. Her heart tightened. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot. It was still happening outside these walls. And now, there was a chance that her people were getting closer. Vera quickly stood up, her body still weak, but her instincts kicking in. She stumbled towards Jake, who was sitting at the table, writing something in a small journal. His back was to her, but he didn't need to hear her footsteps to know something was wrong. He had gotten used to her every movement, every glance. "What is it?" he asked, his voice steady as he turned to face her. He could see the panic in her eyes, and that worried him more than anything else. "It's them," Vera said, her voice trembling. "My people. They're coming. I can hear their ships." Jake didn't waste any time. He stood up, his face hardening, and moved to the small equipment corner. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice firm but not unkind. "I need to check the comms. If they're coming, we need to prepare." Vera nodded, her hands shaking as she sank back onto the bed. She wanted to help. She wanted to fight. But her body still wasn't fully healed, and she couldn't risk making herself worse. She had to trust Jake. But that wasn't easy, especially now. Her people were out there, and they would not stop until every last human was dead. Jake was moving quickly around the shelter, checking various screens and pulling up data on the small terminal. His face was tense, his eyes scanning the information. The reality of the situation hit him hard. If her people arrived, it would be dangerous for both of them. They would be forced to pick sides, and he had already made his decision. He had to protect her. But that meant he might have to fight his own people. The silence between them felt heavy as the two of them waited. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, the kind of silence that hinted at a growing storm just beyond the horizon. The weight of what was coming hung over them, and neither of them could escape it. Jake didn't want to fight, but if it came down to it, he wouldn't hesitate. He had made a promise to save her, and he would do everything in his power to keep that promise. "Vera," Jake began, his voice softer now, "you need to understand something. I'm not going to let them hurt you. If they come, I'll do what I have to." Vera met his gaze, her chest tight. "You're willing to kill your own kind to protect me." Jake's expression was grim, but there was a determination in his eyes. "I'm not killing anyone, Vera. I'm protecting you. But if it comes to that, if it's between you and them..." He trailed off, his gaze falling to the floor as if the weight of the decision was too much for him to bear. The tension was unbearable. Every moment that passed felt like an eternity. The noise outside grew louder, and Vera could hear the engines of the ships as they approached. It wouldn't be long now. She could feel the sense of impending doom creeping up on her. Her people would not be merciful. They would do whatever it took to destroy the humans, and she would be forced to choose. Jake continued to monitor the situation, his face hard as he prepared himself for whatever was coming. He knew that the moment her people arrived, there would be no turning back. He would have to protect her. And that meant choosing a side, one that he hadn't fully understood until now. Vera swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't bring herself to trust him completely yet, but there was something about him that made her want to believe in him. He had saved her life, after all. But was that enough? Could she put aside her training, her duty to her people, to trust a human? The war had never been this complicated before. The lines between good and evil were no longer clear. The tension between Vera and Jake was growing. It was impossible to ignore the unease in the air as they both waited in silence, knowing that the moment of truth was approaching. Vera could feel the weight of her people coming closer with every passing second. The deep-rooted loyalty to her race battled with the new emotions that had begun to form, emotions she couldn't explain. But the truth was, the fight inside her was not only against Jake's people, but also against herself. He lifted the child into his arms, careful not to aggravate his wounds, and slowly moved toward the exit. His boots made no sound on the charred ground, but his eyes were sharp, scanning every corner, every shadow. He couldn't afford to be caught off guard. The child's weight was a burden, but it was nothing compared to the burden of responsibility that weighed on his shoulders. The soldier made his way through the wreckage, carefully stepping over broken concrete and twisted metal. The child's face was pale, but his eyes fluttered open for a moment, meeting the soldier's gaze. There was a flicker of recognition, and then, just as quickly, his eyelids closed again. "Hang in there, kid," the soldier muttered under his breath. "We're almost there." But just as they neared the edge of the building, the sound of enemy voices reached his ears. The soldier's blood ran cold. They had found them. The soldier's mind raced, but there was no time to think. The only option was to fight. The soldier lowered the child to the ground, hiding him behind a broken wall of concrete. He knew it wouldn't be long before the patrol came into view. He had to act fast. The soldier pulled out his weapon, a sleek, compact rifle designed for close-quarters combat. It was his last line of defense, and he couldn't afford to miss. The enemy soldiers were close now. The soldier could hear their footsteps echoing through the wreckage, their voices low but tense as they searched for survivors. He crouched behind the wall, his rifle aimed at the narrow gap where they would come into view. His breathing was steady, his heart pounding in his chest, but his hands were calm. He had been in situations like this before. He knew what to do. The first enemy soldier appeared, moving cautiously as he scanned the area. The soldier didn't hesitate. He fired. The shot rang out, sharp and clear, and the enemy soldier collapsed in a heap, his body falling into the debris with a heavy thud. But there were more. The soldier quickly reloaded, preparing for the next wave. The second enemy soldier appeared, this time from the left. The soldier aimed, his finger tightening on the trigger, but before he could pull it, another explosion rocked the building. The force of the blast sent a shockwave through the area, knocking the soldier off his feet. His rifle flew from his hands, and he hit the ground hard, his vision blurring from the impact. For a moment, the world spun. The soldier's head was ringing, and his vision was distorted. He fought to regain his senses, but he could hear the voices of the enemy soldiers growing louder. They were closing in. If he didn't act quickly, they would overwhelm him. With a grunt of effort, the soldier pushed himself to his feet. His legs were weak, his body bruised from the blast, but he couldn't stop now. The child was depending on him. The enemy soldiers were only a few feet away, their weapons aimed at him, ready to strike. The soldier had only one choice. He charged. The soldier moved with speed and precision, using his body as a shield to protect the child. He threw himself into the path of the enemy, knocking the soldiers off balance. His fists were his weapons now, pounding into the enemy with every ounce of strength he had left. He fought like a man possessed, using every move he had learned in years of combat training to take down his foes. One soldier tried to reach for his weapon, but the soldier was faster. He slammed his fist into the enemy's face, sending him to the ground with a single blow. Another soldier charged at him from behind, but the soldier spun around, delivering a kick that sent him flying into the nearby rubble. Finally, with the last soldier on the ground, the soldier took a moment to catch his breath. His chest heaved with exhaustion, but there was no time to rest. He had to move. The child was still waiting for him. The soldier returned to the child, who was trembling behind the broken wall, his wide eyes filled with fear. The soldier didn't say anything. He just reached out, lifting the child into his arms once again, and continued moving. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since this nightmare began, the soldier felt like they had a chance. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the desolate landscape. The soldier could feel the weight of the day pressing down on him as he moved through the wreckage. His body was sore, bruised from the earlier fights, and the child in his arms was still feverish, though he seemed to be holding on for now. The soldier glanced down at the boy, his small face pale and covered in dirt, and for a moment he wondered if he was doing the right thing. Were they really safe now? Or were they just running from one danger to the next? The battle was brutal, and the enemy forces were relentless. The sky was filled with the sounds of energy blasts, the crackle of weapons discharging, and the screams of those caught in the crossfire. Vera's heart pounded in her chest as she took down one enemy after another, her mind focused on the task at hand. The blood of her people was spilled, but so was the blood of the humans who had fought beside her. The battlefield felt like a living, breathing entity, with every moment more chaotic than the last. She had never seen war like this before. The chaos was overwhelming, but in the midst of it, there was something else, something she hadn't expected. A sense of unity. Jake was there, fighting beside her every step of the way, not as an enemy, but as an ally. Their connection, born from trust and necessity, had become something more. They moved as one, each anticipating the other's moves, protecting one another in ways that transcended words. In the heat of battle, there was no time for doubts, no time for questions. There was only the fight to survive. The enemy forces were beginning to retreat, but not without a final desperate push. As the last wave of soldiers advanced on their position, Vera and Jake knew they had one final chance to end it. The moment of truth had come. They could either fight to the bitter end, or they could use everything they had learned together to turn the tide. With a glance, Vera made the decision. She and Jake would make one last stand, and they would do it together. They rose from their cover, weapons raised, and charged toward the remaining enemies. The final clash was intense, the air crackling with energy as weapons collided, and the sounds of explosions echoed across the battlefield. For a moment, everything seemed to blur, the flashing lights, the noise, the chaos. But as the final blow was struck, everything went quiet. The enemy forces had been defeated. The battlefield was silent, save for the sound of their heavy breathing. Vera and Jake stood in the midst of the wreckage, both covered in dust and blood, but alive. They had done it. They had fought, side by side, and survived. The battle was over, but a new alliance had been born. In the aftermath, as they looked at one another, they realized that they had come to trust each other in ways they never thought possible. This fight was just the beginning, but one thing was certain. Together, they could face anything. And their bond, forged in the heat of battle, would carry them forward into whatever challenges lay ahead. The silence that followed the final clash felt surreal. Vera and Jake stood side by side, battered but alive, surveying the battlefield. The once thriving landscape now lay in ruins, filled with the remnants of the enemy forces and the dust of destruction. The air was heavy, still charged with the remnants of energy blasts and the distant echoes of battle. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something more to happen. Jake's heart was still racing as he glanced at Vera. She looked different now, her face set with a newfound strength. The coldness in her eyes had faded, replaced by something softer, something more human. It was as though the fight had transformed her, and in some strange way, it had done the same for him. He could still hardly believe how far they had come. From the moment they had met, enemies on opposite sides of an intergalactic war, to this very moment where they had fought together as allies. They had survived against impossible odds, and the trust that had been built between them was something neither of them had ever expected. Vera had gone from seeing him as nothing more than a human soldier to understanding him as a person, and he had learned that not all aliens were enemies. Some were just like him, lost, searching for meaning, and capable of change. But the war was far from over. The enemy forces might have been defeated here, but the greater conflict still raged on across the stars. Vera knew that even though they had won this battle, the war was far from over. Her people were still out there, and there were more battles to fight, more alliances to build. But now she had something she hadn't had before, a reason to fight, a purpose beyond the orders she had been given. Looking at Jake, she knew that he had given her that purpose. He had shown her that strength came not only from weapons and power, but from the heart. And it was that strength, the strength they had both discovered within themselves, that would carry them forward. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Jake asked, his voice steady, but with a trace of uncertainty. Vera nodded, her expression firm. "I don't know what's coming next, but I know we'll face it together." The princess's mind raced as she fired again, her hand steady despite the chaos around her. She had been betrayed by her own people, left for dead in a cruel twist of fate. But now, here she was, fighting for her life. And for something more. She was fighting for her humanity. For the chance to prove that she was more than just a weapon to be used and discarded. She was a person, with a purpose, with a future. Nathan's voice broke through her thoughts, sharp and commanding. "Keep your head down. They're pushing us back." The princess nodded, ducking behind cover as another volley of energy blasts whizzed past her, narrowly missing her. She gritted her teeth, trying to ignore the fear gnawing at her. She couldn't afford to be afraid now. Not when they were so close to the end. Nathan was already moving again, shifting positions with practiced ease. His rifle cracked with deadly accuracy, taking out 2 more soldiers in rapid succession. The princess could see the strain in his movements, the sweat beading on his forehead, but he was relentless. He wasn't going to stop, not while she was by his side. For a brief moment, the princess caught her breath. She saw the enemy soldiers closing in, their cloaking devices flickering as they moved silently through the room. They were getting closer, and the walls were closing in. But she wasn't alone. Nathan was there, his presence a constant source of strength. The sounds of battle raged on, but for a moment, everything slowed. The princess's mind focused on the task at hand. She couldn't allow herself to panic. Not now. Not when they were so close. She could feel the power in her hands, the strength in her aim. She was a warrior now. She would not let them take her again. With a steady breath, she emerged from behind cover, her energy pistol raised high. She fired again, hitting another soldier square in the chest. Her aim was true, her confidence growing with each shot. She could hear Nathan's voice calling to her, encouraging her to keep going, to fight harder. And she did. The 2 of them moved together, covering each other as they fought their way through the remaining soldiers. They worked as a team, each knowing exactly what the other was doing, anticipating each other's moves. It was a rhythm, a dance of survival that neither of them had ever planned on. But now it was their only chance. The enemy's numbers were thinning, but the battle was far from over. Nathan's movements were faster now, his rifle never stopping as he picked off the last few soldiers. The princess followed his lead, her shots ringing out with precision. Each soldier that fell only fueled her determination. They couldn't stop now, not when they were so close to victory. Suddenly, the door to the safe house burst open, and a new wave of soldiers poured in, their cloaking devices shimmering as they deactivated. The princess's heart sank, but she didn't hesitate. She raised her weapon and fired. But this time, the odds were against them. They had already fought through so much, and the enemy was relentless. There was no end in sight. Nathan's voice rang out, urgent. "We need to fall back. Now." The princess hesitated, looking at him with a mixture of determination and uncertainty. She didn't want to retreat, not when they were so close, but Nathan's eyes told her everything she needed to know. There was no way they could win this fight without reinforcements. They were too outnumbered. With a heavy heart, the princess nodded. They had no choice but to retreat. Nathan moved swiftly, covering her as they made their way toward the back exit. The enemy was closing in, but they still had a chance. The night was their only ally, and as long as they could escape, they had hope. It was a small hope, but it was enough to keep them moving forward. The safe house had been their sanctuary, but now it was nothing more than a battleground, a place where survival had become the only goal. But the princess knew one thing for sure. As long as Nathan was by her side, she wouldn't give up. No matter how hard the fight, no matter how desperate the situation, they would keep moving. They would survive. And when the time came, they would make their stand. Together. The battle was over. The battlefield lay quiet, the echoes of gunfire and explosions fading into the silence of the night. Nathan and the princess stood together, bloodied and bruised but alive. Their clothes were torn, their bodies exhausted, but the connection they had formed during the fight was stronger than ever. They had survived the impossible, and now they had to face the aftermath. Nathan took a deep breath, wiping sweat from his brow. His hands were still shaking from the intensity of the battle, but he couldn't afford to let it show. The princess was standing beside him, her eyes locked on the horizon. He could see the weariness in her posture, the weight of everything she had been through. But there was something else in her eyes, something he hadn't seen before, a spark of hope. "Are you okay?" Nathan asked, his voice soft but filled with concern. The princess looked up at him, her face showing a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. She had never asked for this. She had never wanted to be in this fight. Yet here she was, standing alongside him, a survivor. "I'll be fine," she replied quietly. But Nathan could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. She had been through so much: betrayal, abandonment, and death. But she had managed to hold on. It wasn't just her physical strength that had gotten her through, but her inner resolve. It was a strength that Nathan admired and respected. They had both lost so much in this war, but they had also gained something neither of them had expected. A bond forged in the heat of battle, in the moments where they had relied on each other to survive. Nathan had never thought he would be fighting side by side with an alien princess, let alone risking his life to protect her. But now, after everything they had been through, he couldn't imagine being anywhere else. The princess looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling as she clutched her weapon. "I never thought I would end up like this," she whispered, her voice filled with regret. "I was meant to be a ruler, to lead my people. But now, I don't even know if I'll ever be able to go back." Nathan's heart softened as he placed a hand on her shoulder, offering her a comforting touch. "You've already led, in ways that most people never could," he said. "You've shown strength, courage, and compassion. That's what makes a leader." The princess looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for something more, something deeper. And in that moment, Nathan understood. He had always been focused on surviving, on completing the mission. But now, standing here with her, he realized there was more at stake than just survival. There was the chance to rebuild, to make something better out of the destruction they had faced. The princess sighed, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of the world had finally caught up to her. She had been through so much, and yet it wasn't just the physical wounds that hurt the most. It was the emotional scars, the sense of betrayal that lingered in her heart. Her people had abandoned her, left her to die. But Nathan had found her, had chosen to fight for her, even when there was no guarantee of success. "I don't know if I can ever forgive them," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My own people turned their backs on me. But you?" She looked at him again, her gaze softening. "You saved me. You didn't have to, but you did. Why?" Nathan didn't hesitate. "Because you deserve a chance. Everyone does." It was simple, but it was the truth. The princess had shown him a side of herself he had never expected to see. She was more than just a royal figurehead. She was a person with hopes, dreams, and a deep desire to protect her people. She was not a symbol to be used and discarded. She was someone worth saving. The princess smiled weakly, the corners of her lips lifting just enough to show gratitude. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, her voice more certain now. "But I know I want to fight for it. With you." Nathan nodded. "Together, then." The words hung in the air between them, as if they were both trying to make sense of what had just been spoken. It wasn't just a promise. It was a new beginning. They had survived the worst of it, And now they could focus on the future. But the future wouldn't be easy. There would be more battles to fight, more enemies to face. Yet, as long as they were together, they would be stronger than anything that came their way. As the stars began to twinkle in the sky above, Nathan and the princess stood side by side, their silhouettes outlined by the soft light of the moon. The world was still a dangerous place, and they both knew the road ahead would be long. But for the first time in a long time, there was a glimmer of hope. Together, they had found something worth fighting for. And that made all the difference. The end of the battle didn't mark the end of their journey. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where trust, loyalty, and love would guide them through whatever challenges awaited. As they walked toward the horizon, side by side, the future seemed a little less uncertain. And for the first time, the princess knew she wasn't alone. Nathan was with her. And together, they could face anything.